It's a fine day, and people are strolling along the beach quite unconcerned about what the weather's doing. But one thing you can learn here is that the weather can turn very quickly. Sunshine, hail, thunder, mist, you can get them all in a twinkling. Pretty well everything we do here on the West Cliff is guided by what the heavens are doing. But at least we can always dash for cover and get a brew on. Hello, I'm Peter John Cooper. Today's story is about how the lives of a couple of young people were blighted by chance and the weather. It's called The Fog. Once or twice a year, a particularly thick white fog would roll in across the bay and envelop the town. And even though on the hills and high ground around the sun was shining and the blue sky was filled with the merry song of skylarks, the fog would lie heavy over the houses like a German quilt. And which of the fishermen caught in the bay in such a har, and hearing the tide racing over the invisible rocks and reefs, would not promise his future life and wealth, and even his family to his Creator, if only he or she would get him safe back to the beach? So it was that Tobias Smallwood, feeling his way up the high street, having indeed landed safely on the strand, found his hand on the door of the Ebenezer Chapel and felt obliged to enter. Having pushed the door open, Tobias at once fell to his knees, making promise after extravagant promise, dedicating his life and the lives of his as yet unborn children to his Maker, and forswearing all his vices, including drinking and gambling, but which, the fog having lifted an hour or so later, he had forgotten completely. And by the evening this latter-day Abraham was sitting in the pub, surrounded by his cronies, boasting and cursing as he ever had. Josiah Stint, his neighbour, was the stockman on a large local estate, and therefore considered himself a cut above the poor fisherman. And now he was boasting that he was soon to marry, and that the modern way of doing things was to have a properly planned and organised family. His new wife, being a teacher and of an orderly and modern frame of mind, and with his skill as a stock breeder, they would follow current trends and plan to have a family of just 4 children, all girls at the wish of his wife. "My 4 little heifers they will be." Tobias, pint in hand, scoffed at such presumption, but, being an arch rival to Stint since school days, boasted that if ever he got married, he would have not just 4 children, but a matching set of 4 sons. The pub grew silent, and after a brief pause, a wager was made. But having made the bet, Tobias suddenly remembered the oath he had taken in the chapel that very morning. Fishermen are a superstitious breed, and Tobias felt uncomfortable that he had already broken several of his promises to his maker. 4 sons, named for they books in the Bible. You'll never afford to keep a family of 4 boys on a fisherman's income, smirked Josiah. By my good management, I will have enough to put aside to buy all my girls somewhere to live when they grows up. And because he could never let an itch alone until it was scratched raw, Tobias, believing hazily that the Bible somehow favoured fishermen, he would make plenty enough money to buy each of his sons a cottage to live in. In any case, Tobias Smallwood, you'll never marry in the first place. Who'd have he? Well, that question was easily settled. Tobias had had his eye on the barmaid of the Anchor for some time, and it only took a matter of hours, a new razor, and some Christmas aftershave the next morning to surmount that hurdle. And within the time that these things take, Matthew was born, duly followed by Mark and Luke. And with his wife pregnant again, he considered not only the bet was as good as won, but that he had somehow completed his pact with his Creator. Meanwhile, Josiah and the very modern and organised Mrs. Stint had duly produced 3 girls. The town was agog with the possibility that there might be a thrilling run-in to the winning post. A matching set of 4 girls on one side versus 4 boys on the other. And I must remind you, this was in the days before ultrasound scans and so on, so the outcome of this wager was entirely in the hands of the Father Almighty. Even the local newspaper got wind of the affair and carried updates during the final furlongs of this rather peculiar competition. But then, the inevitable bombshells of fate. The modern Mrs. Stint went into labour and produced a fine bouncing boy. Tobias was overjoyed. He had won. But then his own wife was delivered of a girl. All bets seemed to be off because while both had achieved the required number, neither had the full matching set. What's more, Tobias's compact with his God had rather failed. But the hurt was made all the more stinging when Josiah Stint announced in the pub that he was the victor after all. He hadn't realised at first, but the rather strange and unusual name his literary-minded wife had chosen for the boy took on significance nobody could have guessed. Thus, the baby brother to Charlotte, Emily, and Anne was to be christened Branwell. As far as he considered it, it was game, set, and match. Tobias threw in his hand, and in a fit of pique with God, he and his wife named their little girl Samantha. And so the youngest children grew up, both resenting the exigencies of fate that the town, and more specifically their parents, had tried to lumber them with. Young Branwell came to believe that he owed his name and therefore his whole existence entirely for the sake of a bet. Meanwhile, Samantha grew up resenting the fact that every time she caught her father looking at her, she saw only pain and disappointment. Their bitterness grew. They became, in their own ways, introspective, Samantha remaining hermit-like in her room all her teenage years, writing poetry, while Branwell retired to the shed at the bottom of the garden to paint wild, stormy landscapes. All the while both raged at how stupid and unjust fate and their fathers had been in their making. But there is always something new for a hard-bitten gambler to make a wager on. As these things happen, despite the enmity of their fathers, Charlotte married Matthew. Emily became engaged to Mark, and Anne was seen out with Luke. The gamblers in the pub began to get excited again. Could there be a new twist on the old wager? 3 brothers and a sister marrying 3 sisters and a brother. Once again, the local newspapers started running paragraphs on the possible romance, and money, in rather large quantities, began to change hands. All that had to happen was that Samantha should be persuaded of Branwell's eligibility, and Samantha's many charms should be made apparent to Branwell. 4 out of 4 would be something rather than nothing. Not surprisingly, however, the 2 young people were entirely unsympathetic to the idea. It was all too gruesome. They began actively avoiding each other, leaving any party or gathering where the other was present, and speaking of the other in entirely dismissive, even abusive terms. They were not going to allow themselves to be any more the playthings of the town. They avowed a deep hatred for each other, which was something of a pity, as they had a great deal in common. They both loved books and art and nature, and took a common interest in science and the welfare of the planet and all who dwelt therein. And what's more, they laughed, if and when they laughed at all, at the same sort of jokes. But their bitterness towards each other became more and more entrenched and more outspoken the more and more the expectations of the whole town was loaded on them. The marriages of the 3 pairs of elder siblings came and progressed in the bumpy ways that these things do. Josiah duly bought the cottage next down the hill for Charlotte and Matthew. That year was a good one for the mackerel, and Tobias was just able to keep his promise to buy the next one down from that for Mark and Emily. And Josiah responded with the next down the hill for Luke and Anne. But alas, the resolution of Samantha and Branwell was unshakable. And when Tobias and Josiah died within days of each other, so did any last vestige of their rivalry. But in their wills was just enough for the last 2 cottages to be bought for the 2 youngest children. The two widows continued to live in the first two cottages at the top of the high street, with their children strung out down the hill, one after the other like beads on a necklace. But it meant, if you need it pointing out any more, that the two who detested the very sight of each other lived in identical cottages next door to each other at the bottom of the hill. And accordingly, the ways they used to avoid meeting each other became more and more elaborate, with each watching out from behind their blinds to see when the other had gone out to the shops before they too felt it safe to emerge for a day out on the cliffs. In fact, they became, by this close observation, very familiar with each other's habits. With the windows open, Branwell could hear Samantha reciting her charming verses. He in turn put on his painted music extra loud, which annoyed Samantha intensely because, coincidentally, she was about to put on that very album herself. And then came one of those girt thick blankets of fog that had prompted Tobias's rash and unaccomplished promise all those years ago, and put in train all the events that had coloured the young people's lives. Branwell, who had been painting en plein air on the green hills above the town, descended into the thick white enveloping Har. It was beginning to get dark, and he quickly lost his bearings. He had to drop to his knees to find the curb edge of the road, and he began feeling his way door to door down the high street, his easel and satchels draped round him like a clumsy mule. At one point he hit himself on the face with a half-opened paint box and spread a multicoloured mask all over. There were few clues to where he was, but he finally managed to feel his way along beside the row of cottages of his siblings. He crawled along beside them, but soon lost count. Is this number 2 or number 3? Number 3 or 4? His knees were sore and he was bruised, and at last he reached up to find the door handle. And just as Tobias had done all those years ago at the chapel, pushed the door open and crawled in. On his hands and knees, festooned with art equipment, his face smeared with wet paint, he was greeted by a gasp, and then by howls of laughter. Fate had clouded his ability to count. And when Samantha brought a mirror over to show him what she was laughing at, he too saw the joke. Justice was done, and the president of the Immortals, in the Aeschylean phrase, had ended his sport with them. Their laughter had freed themselves of the curse of the expectations of others and their own prejudices. As if to confound any last intention by the citizens of the town, they never actually married. But they did go on to have a ragtag bunch of carefree toddlers that they never bothered to count, and who they taught to take no heed of what others thought or might plan for them, and to find happiness where chance threw it up. Well, I hope you enjoyed that story. But tell me, how has your life been affected by fate, or by the wishes and whims of others? Do you wish that fate would go away and just leave you alone, always hanging around like a big dog with a slobbering tongue? Honestly, it doesn't have to be like that. I can tell you how to avoid fate. Just send me your bank details and I guarantee